Some of these ships have been sitting on the ocean floor for thousands of years, and they look like they went down yesterday. One of them still has its cargo holds packed with motorcycles, trucks, and ammunition, sitting in the Red Sea, right now, exactly where they landed in 1941. 15 ships found perfectly preserved on the ocean floor, starting at the bottom. 15, the holds are still full. The SS Thistlegorm left Glasgow in June of 1941 carrying supplies for the British 8th Army in North Africa. She was 126 meters long, a standard cargo vessel. Nothing unusual about her until you look at what she was carrying. Motorcycles, Bedford trucks with rubber tires still inflated, Bren gun carriers, crates of rifles and boots and ammunition, 2 locomotives on her rear deck, still bolted to their flat cars. She never made it to her destination. On the night of October the 28th, 2 German Heinkel bombers, acting on intelligence about a British supply convoy, found the Thistlegorm anchored in the strait near the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula, and dropped 2 bombs directly into her stern munitions hold. The explosion was catastrophic. She went down in minutes, taking 9 of her crew with her. The wreck settled on the seabed at about 30 meters depth, shallow enough, it turns out, to become one of the most visited dive sites in the world. Jacques Cousteau found her in the early 1950s and then, characteristically, told almost nobody where she was. The wreck was essentially rediscovered by Egyptian dive operators in the 1980s, and by the time the diving world caught up to what was down there, it had been sitting undisturbed for 4 decades. What they found was a warehouse. The motorcycles, BSA and Norton models, are still on their kickstands in the hold, arranged in rows the way they were loaded, salt encrusted now and colonized by coral, but upright. The Bedford trucks still have their steering wheels, boots are still bundled in pairs, the rifles are stacked, the ammunition is still live, which is not a small detail. Unexploded ordnance is part of why the wreck is a dive-only site and why nobody touches anything. The locomotives on the deck are the image that stops people. 2 full-size steam engines sitting on the floor of the Red Sea, draped in soft coral and surrounded by glassfish. They were too heavy to have moved far when the ship went down, and they haven't moved since. The Thistlegorm sits at 30 meters in warm, clear water, which means recreational divers can reach her with standard certification. Somewhere around 250,000 people dive her every year, which makes her, depending on how you count, one of the most visited shipwrecks anywhere on the planet. She looks like she could be restocked and sailed tomorrow. 14. The ship with no oxygen. About 80 kilometers off the Bulgarian coast at a depth of 2,000 meters, deeper than most submarines ever operate, a wooden trading vessel lies on its side on the Black Sea floor. The mast is still standing. The rudder is still attached. Ropes are coiled on the deck as though someone set them down an hour ago. The ship is 2,400 years old. It was found in 2018 by the Black Sea Maritime Archaeology Project, a joint British-Bulgarian research team working with remotely operated vehicles in water so deep that recovery was never really on the table. They were there to map the sea floor. What they found instead was a Greek merchant vessel so completely preserved that the researchers could identify the vessel type from ancient pottery. The same hull shape, the same proportions, depicted on ceramics in museums across Europe. The reason it survived has nothing to do with luck. Below a certain depth in the Black Sea, roughly 150 meters down, the water contains almost no dissolved oxygen. No oxygen means almost no biological activity. No biological activity means almost nothing eats the wood. The ship has been sitting in what amounts to a chemical deep freeze since roughly 400 BCE, untouched in the cold and the dark, while every empire on the surface rose and collapsed around it. The hull is about 23 meters long, which is modest. The kind of vessel that would have been completely unremarkable in any harbor of the ancient Mediterranean. That's part of what makes it strange. Not a flagship, not a warship. Just a working boat that went down and was preserved by the absence of everything. The Black Sea Maritime Archaeology Project documented over 60 other wrecks in the same waters during the same expedition, spanning 2,500 years of maritime history. Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, many in extraordinary condition. The Greek vessel was the most intact of all of them, but it wasn't even the only ancient ship they found in a single survey season. The team used a remotely operated vehicle to take close-up footage of the hull, the deck fittings, the coiled rope. That footage exists. You can watch it. A rope coiled on the deck of a ship that sailed when Aristotle was alive, and it looks like it was left there this morning, preserved by the absence of everything. What's at number 13? The warship that sank on its first day. Stockholm, April 10th, 1628. The Vasa was the most heavily armed warship Sweden had ever built. 64 bronze cannons across 2 gun decks, a hull elaborately carved with lions and Roman emperors, and biblical scenes. The whole thing painted in reds and blacks and golds. King Gustav II Adolf had personally demanded the second gun deck be added to the design mid-build. Nobody told him that might be a problem. She launched in the afternoon. She sailed approximately 1,300 meters. Then a gust of wind caught her and she rolled. The lower gun port, which were open to show off the cannons, scooped water, and she went straight down in full view of the Stockholm harbor, in front of the crowds who had come to watch her depart. 30 of her crew drowned. The rest of the roughly 450 people on board were rescued. The ship sank in 32 meters of water, which was shallow enough that her mast tips were still visible above the surface. She sat there for 333 years. Salvage attempts started almost immediately. Swedish engineers in the 1630s managed to drag some of the cannons off the deck using a primitive diving bell, which is its own extraordinary story. Then, nothing. Centuries passed. The Vasa became mud and cold water and eventually a footnote. Anders Franzén, a Swedish engineer and amateur maritime archaeologist, spent years searching for her by dragging a coring tool across the harbor floor. In 1956, he pulled up a core sample of black oak that hadn't rotted. 2 years later, they found her, sitting upright, almost completely intact. The cold, low salinity water of Stockholm harbor had killed off the shipworm, a wood-boring mollusk that destroys wooden wrecks in salt water, and the anaerobic mud had done the rest. The Vasa came up 98% original timber, her hull, her ornate carvings, her internal fittings largely preserved after 3 centuries on the bottom. The raised ship is now in its own dedicated museum in Stockholm, one of the best attended museums in Scandinavia. Inside the hull, they found the personal belongings of the crew, backgammon pieces, a box of butter, a sailor's chest with clothes still folded inside, coins, tools, a leather shoe with the laces still threaded. She never made it out of the harbor. 45 million people have visited since. All right, number 12. Paul Allen died in 2018. Before he did, his research vessel, RV Petrel, spent several years systematically finding some of the most significant warship wrecks in the Pacific, a project so well funded and methodical that it located ships historians had searched for across decades. In 2019, the team announced they had found the USS Lexington. She went down in the Coral Sea in May of 1942 during the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval battle in history where the opposing ships never saw each other, fought entirely by aircraft launched from carriers. The Lexington took multiple torpedo and bomb hits, caught fire, and burned for hours before the order came to abandon ship. Of her crew of 2,951, 1,600 were evacuated. 216 didn't make it. She lies at 2,400 meters, deep enough that she sat completely undisturbed for 77 years. What the Petrel's remotely operated vehicles found was a ship in extraordinary condition. The Lexington settled upright on the seafloor, her flight deck largely intact, her hull structure holding. In the hangar bays below the flight deck, aircraft are still sitting where they were spotted for their last missions. Grumman Wildcats and Douglas Devastators, identifiable by their tail markings, some still carrying their ordnance. The aircraft weren't thrown around by the sinking. They went down with the ship and stayed put. The tail numbers are still legible. After nearly 80 years at 2,400 meters in total darkness, you can still read the individual aircraft identifiers on the planes in the hangar, which honestly is a strange thing to sit with. The Lexington was one of the US Navy's first purpose-built aircraft carriers. converted from a battlecruiser hull whose construction had been stopped by an international arms treaty in the 1920s. She was enormous, 270 meters long, roughly the length of 3 city blocks, and she'd been in service for only 15 years when she went down. The Navy listed her as lost. The crew called her Lady Lex. The wreck is a protected war grave under US law, which means the ROV footage from the Petrel is the closest anyone will ever get. No recovery, no salvage. The aircraft in the hangar aren't going anywhere. Still in formation, 2,400 meters down. The 11th ship's story, the one the cold water kept. In the summer of 1564, the Mars, flagship of the Swedish Navy and the most heavily armed warship in the Baltic at the time, sailed into a battle off the island of Åland against a combined Danish-Lubekian fleet and was destroyed by an explosion so catastrophic it reportedly killed everyone on board, along with hundreds of enemy soldiers who had boarded her. She burned for 2 days before she sank. Contemporary accounts described the blast as visible from the Swedish coastline. She stayed lost for 450 years. A team of Swedish and British divers found her in 2011, sitting at 72 meters beneath the Baltic, deep enough to require technical diving equipment, shallow enough that human eyes could reach her. What they found was a ship in a state of preservation that stopped the team cold. The hull was standing. The cannon ports were intact. The bronze cannons, dozens of them, were still in place. Personal objects belonging to the crew were scattered across the interior. Coins, navigational instruments, the kind of everyday objects that don't survive 4.5 centuries in warm water. The Baltic kept her the same way it kept the Vasa. Cold temperatures, low salinity, almost no shipworm. The wood hadn't rotted. The structure hadn't collapsed. Skeletal remains of crew members were found inside, still articulated, meaning the bones were still connected, still in roughly the positions of people who had been below decks when the ship went down. 450 years on the seafloor, you can still tell where they fell. The Mars is considered one of the most significant warship discoveries in Baltic maritime history, and she's still being actively excavated, each dive season turning up new finds. A gold ring recovered from the wreck bore an inscription in Latin. A bronze mortar, ornately decorated, was lifted from the site in nearly perfect condition. The level of craftsmanship visible in the recovered objects tells you something about the ambitions of the Swedish crown in the 1560s, and none of it was supposed to survive. She sits at 72 meters in darkness, still giving up what she's been holding for nearly 5 centuries. 10, the gold is still down there. Cartagena, Colombia, 1708. A Spanish galleon called the San Jose was carrying the single largest treasure cargo ever loaded onto a ship. Gold coins, silver bars, emeralds from the Colombian mines, and a range of other valuables collected from across the Spanish colonial empire and destined for the court of King Philip V in Madrid. Estimates of the cargo's current value range from $17 billion to over $20 billion, depending on how you count the emeralds. She was intercepted by a British squadron under Commodore Charles Wager on June 8th of 1708. In the battle that followed, the San Jose's powder magazine exploded. She sank in minutes, taking nearly 600 men with her. The British took no treasure. The ship went to the bottom with everything aboard. She sat undiscovered for nearly 300 years. Colombian marine archaeologists found her in 2015, lying at approximately 600 meters off the coast of Cartagena, deep enough to require remotely operated vehicles, shallow enough that everyone could see exactly what was there. The government announced the discovery with footage of gold coins scattered across the seabed, encrusted but unmistakable, sitting in open water exactly where they'd settled in 1708. Then the argument started. And they have not stopped. Colombia claims the wreck as national heritage. Spain argues the San Jose was a sovereign warship and the wreck belongs to the Spanish crown. Bolivia has filed a claim on the basis that the silver came from mines in what is now Bolivian territory. A US-based salvage company called Sea Search Armada has been in litigation for decades, arguing they located the wreck first and are owed a share. A claim the Colombian courts have repeatedly rejected, but which keeps resurfacing. If this is the kind of thing that gets you, drop a like, leave a comment. It genuinely helps. Now, back to it. Colombia has announced plans to raise selected artifacts and eventually create an underwater museum, though the timelines for either have shifted repeatedly. The treasure itself, the coins, the emeralds, the silver, is still on the seabed. No one has touched it. 4 separate legal claimants are still arguing over a ship that none of them can access. 4 claimants, 1 ship, $20 billion, still on the seafloor. 9. The man who found the gold and went to prison. 3 tons of California Gold Rush gold went down with the SS Central America in September of 1857. Individual nuggets, raw dust, minted coins, and 45 gold bars still bearing the assay stamps and serial numbers of the San Francisco Mint. The ship sank in a hurricane 600 kilometers off the coast of South Carolina, taking 425 passengers with her. The gold was insured, the insurance companies paid out. Then everybody moved on. For 130 years, the Central America sat in roughly 2,200 meters of water, beyond the reach of any salvage technology that existed at the time of the sinking, deep enough that the location was essentially theoretical. Tommy Thompson was an ocean engineer from Ohio who spent years developing a custom deep-sea salvage robot specifically to find and recover this wreck. He raised private investment, located the ship in 1987, and over the following years recovered gold bars whose assay stamps were still perfectly legible after a century and a half on the ocean floor, exactly as they'd been stamped in San Francisco in 1857. Individual nuggets recovered from the sediment were in the same condition as the day they were loaded. The value of what came up was over $150 million. One of the gold bars alone, a massive specimen piece known as the Eureka bar, weighed over 76 troy pounds, enough gold to make it one of the largest single pieces recovered from any shipwreck anywhere. Then, Thompson did not distribute the proceeds to his investors. He claimed the recovery operation had run at a loss. Investors sued, courts found in their favor. Thompson, rather than comply with the judgments against him, disappeared. He was a fugitive for 2 years before U.S. Marshals found him in a Florida hotel room in 2015, surrounded by gold coins and $2,000 in cash. He was jailed for contempt of court. He has since claimed to have a medical condition that prevents him from remembering where the rest of the assets are. The gold bars are in private collections. The investors are still trying to recover what they're owed. The Eureka bar sold at auction for $8 million. The only person on this list who went to prison because of what he discovered. Consider number 8. The ships nobody listened to find. Inuit communities in the Canadian Arctic had been telling search parties for over a century and a half exactly where the Franklin expedition ships went down. The oral histories described the location, described the condition of the vessels, described men abandoning ship and walking south across the ice. Every professional expedition that went looking for HMS Erebus and HMS Terror between the 1840s and the early 2000s used Western cartography and largely set the testimony aside. The ships were found in 2014 and 2016 respectively in the locations the Inuit oral record had indicated. Sir John Franklin led the expedition out of England in May of 1845 with 128 men and 2 of the most technologically advanced vessels the Royal Navy possessed. Steam-powered, specially reinforced for Arctic ice, provisioned for 3 years. The mission was to complete the Northwest Passage. Both ships became icebound in Victoria Strait in September of 1846 and never moved again. Franklin died aboard Erebus in June of 1847. The remaining crew abandoned both vessels in April of 1848 and attempted to walk to safety. None of them survived. The search for the ships became one of the longest and most expensive maritime hunts in history. Over 30 expeditions across 160 years, costing fortunes and occasionally costing lives. Parks Canada found Erebus in 2014 using side-scan sonar and ROV support, sitting upright on the seabed at approximately 11 meters, shallow enough that early dive surveys could be conducted by recreational divers. Terror was found 2 years later in Terror Bay, named, as it happens, for the ship, also upright, remarkably intact. The Erebus wreck is extraordinary in its preservation. The ship's bell was recovered. Timbers that have been underwater for nearly 180 years are structurally sound. Portholes are still in place. Below decks, the cabins are intact enough that researchers have been able to identify individual officers' quarters by the objects left inside: personal effects, furniture, storage containers. A search team member described opening a cabinet door inside the wreck and finding it still on its hinges. Erebus lies in water so shallow the mass would have been visible from the ice surface when she sank. The Inuit knew this. They said so, repeatedly, for 160 years. 7. The frigate that came home without the treasure. October 5th, 2007. A US-based salvage company called Odyssey Marine Exploration announced it had recovered 500,000 gold and silver coins from an undisclosed location in the Atlantic. The largest underwater treasure recovery in history, they said, worth an estimated $500 million. They flew the cargo to Florida in 17 tons of containers. They called the operation Black Swan and refused to name the wreck. Spain named it for them. Within weeks, the Spanish government had identified the coins as cargo from the Nuestra Señora de las Mercedes, a Spanish naval frigate sunk by the British in 1804 during an engagement off the Portuguese coast. Spain filed suit in US federal court. What followed was 5 years of litigation across multiple jurisdictions. The Mercedes had been sailing from Montevideo to Cadiz carrying colonial revenue. 500,000 coins minted across Spanish America, plus mercury, copper, and other cargo, when a British squadron intercepted her on October 5th, 1804. The engagement lasted minutes. A shot hit the Mercedes powder magazine and she exploded almost instantaneously, killing most of the 249 people aboard. The other Spanish ships surrendered. The British took the survivors to Portugal. The coins went to the bottom of the Atlantic at roughly 1,000 meters depth, where they sat for just over 200 years. Odyssey argued the wreck was in international waters and the coins were fair salvage. Spain argued that a sovereign warship remains the property of the flag nation regardless of where it sinks, a principle of international maritime law that, as it turned out, the courts agreed with. In 2012, the US Supreme Court declined to hear Odyssey's final appeal. The full cargo was returned to Spain. The entire 500,000 coins, flown from a storage facility in Tampa to Madrid in a Spanish Air Force transport. The coins are now in the Museo Nacional de Arqueología Subacuática in Cartagena, Spain, the country that minted them in the city that shares a name with the Colombian port the San Jose never reached. Odyssey Marine spent millions recovering a cargo it was ordered to hand back in full. The Mercedes herself is still on the seabed, designated a protected war grave. The coins she carried for 200 years are in a museum in the country that made them. The 6th ships last morning, July 19th, 1545. Henry VIII was watching from the shore at Southsea Castle when the Mary Rose heeled over and sank. She was his flagship. Built in 1510, rebuilt and expanded in 1536 into one of the most powerful warships in the English fleet, carrying 91 guns across 4 decks. The Tudor court watched her go down in the Solent, roughly a mile and a half from the English coast, in the middle of a battle against a French invasion fleet. The cause is still debated. The lower gun ports were open. She turned sharply. The sea came in. Around 500 men were aboard. Fewer than 40 survived. The Mary Rose sank so fast that the anti-boarding nets strung across her upper deck, designed to stop enemy soldiers from climbing onto the ship, trapped the crew below. The wreck settled into the soft mud of the Solent at an angle, and the mud preserved the lower hull and everything inside it. She was rediscovered in 1971 by a diver named Alexander McKee, who had spent years searching for her using historical records and side-scan sonar. The formal salvage operation that followed became the most watched marine archaeology event in television history. On October the 11th, 1982, the intact lower hull of the Mary Rose was raised from the seabed in a steel cradle while an estimated 60 million people watched live. What the mud had kept for 437 years was staggering in its specificity. Longbows, 137 of them, still strung, still with their linen strings, were found in a single storage chest, the arrows still bundled beside them. leather shoes, a knit comb, a backgammon set, surgeons, tools in their case, pewter plates still stacked in the galley. Sailors' personal chests contain clothing folded as it was left, pocket sundials, a manicure set, objects that belong to specific named individuals who died on that Tuesday morning in 1545. The Mary Rose is now in a dedicated museum in Portsmouth, displayed alongside the hull of HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar in 1805. Two of the most famous warships in English naval history, side by side, separated by 260 years. The longbows are still there, still strung. 5. She's still enduring. Crushed by Antarctic pack ice in November of 1915, Ernest Shackleton's ship Endurance sank stern first in the Weddell Sea and dropped to the bottom while the entire crew watched from the ice surface. They had been camped on the ice beside her for weeks, watching the pressure slowly destroy the hull, unable to do anything. When she finally went under, Shackleton wrote in his diary, "I cannot write about it." The wreck lay 3,000 meters down in one of the most hostile stretches of ocean on Earth for 107 years. A South African-led expedition called Endurance 22 found her in March of 2022 using an autonomous underwater vehicle deployed through a hole cut in the sea ice. The search had failed once before. A previous expedition in 2019 had to abort when its search equipment was lost under the ice. The 2022 team located the wreck within days of reaching the search area, sitting upright on the seafloor at 3,008 meters depth. The footage stopped people cold. The name Endurance is still legible in gold lettering across the stern, fully legible. The hull planking, though cracked from the crushing pressure that sank her, is still intact enough to read the ship's contours clearly. The ship's wheel is in place. The crow's nest, from which lookouts would have scanned for leads in the ice, is still attached to the mast. A single boot sits on the deck, left there or fallen there over a century ago. The Weddell Sea below, about 300 meters, is so cold and the pressure so crushing that organic material decomposes almost imperceptibly slowly. No shipworm, near freezing temperatures. The result is a wooden ship that sank in 1915, looking, in many details, like a ship that sank last year. Shackleton's 27-man crew survived the loss of the ship entirely, all of them, through one of the most extraordinary open boat voyages ever recorded. They were rescued in August of 1916 after nearly 2 years on the ice and sea. The ship they watched sink went down alone and stayed down alone, undisturbed, until the camera found her. She's in a sense still enduring. What's at number 4? The wreck that kept rewriting history. Off the small Greek island of Antikythera, at roughly 45 meters depth, a Roman-era cargo ship has been yielding objects to archaeologists for over 120 years, and the excavation still isn't finished. Sponge divers found the wreck in 1900. What they pulled up in the months that followed transformed what anyone thought they knew about the ancient world. Life-size bronze statues in extraordinary condition, marble sculptures, gold jewelry, glass bowls, amphorae, coins. The cargo was enormous. The ship appears to have been carrying the contents of multiple Greek households or a substantial collection of luxury goods, possibly looted or purchased across the eastern Mediterranean during the 1st century BCE. Then, in 1901, they pulled up what looked like a corroded lump of bronze and wood. It sat in the National Museum in Athens for years, barely examined. When researchers finally looked closely in the 1950s and used X-rays in the 1970s to peer inside, they found gear trains, differential gearing, precision-cut bronze wheels meshing with each other in configurations that shouldn't have existed for another 1,000 years. The Antikythera mechanism is a hand-cranked analog computer for tracking the movements of the sun, moon, and planets, predicting eclipses, and calculating the dates of athletic festivals, including the Olympics. It is accurate. It is mechanically sophisticated. The level of miniaturization involved, dozens of precision gears packed into a device roughly the size of a shoebox, was not matched in European technology until the astronomical clocks of the 14th century CE. Nobody built another one like it for 1,400 years, that we know of. The ship itself sits in fragments across the seabed because the early salvage was not gentle. A major new excavation using closed-circuit rebreathers, allowing divers to work at depth for far longer than standard scuba equipment permits, began in 2014 under the Antikythera Shipwreck project. They have since recovered a bronze spear arm from a statue, human skeletal remains, and fragments of a second mechanism that may be related to the first. A partial skull recovered from the site in 2016 still retains bone, teeth, and, remarkably, preserved DNA. After more than 2,000 years in saltwater, the genetic material was extractable. The individual was male. The analysis confirmed ancient Greek ancestry consistent with the ship's origin. The mechanism is in Athens. The wreck is still being excavated. The question of how many more gear trains are still in the sediment remains open. 3. The armor held. The ship didn't. Built to be unsinkable by British naval standards of the 1930s, or as close to unsinkable as a warship gets, the Bismarck was the most powerful battleship in the German fleet when she sailed on her first and only operational mission in May of 1941. She was 251 meters long, roughly the length of 2.5 football pitches laid end to end. Her armor belt was 32 centimeters of Krupp steel. The Royal Navy committed an entire fleet to stopping her. She sank 8 days after leaving port. The British lost HMS Hood to the Bismarck on May 24th, the largest warship in the Royal Navy, destroyed in under 10 minutes by a shell that penetrated the Hood's deck armor and reached the ammunition magazine. Of Hood's crew of 1,418 men, 3 survived. The shock of the loss sent virtually every available British warship in the Atlantic after the Bismarck. She was hit by a torpedo from a Swordfish biplane, a fabric-covered aircraft so slow that the Bismarck's fire control computers apparently couldn't calculate an intercept solution for it, which jammed her rudder. Unable to steer, circling in the North Atlantic, she was caught on the morning of May 27th and subjected to sustained fire from multiple British warships for nearly 2 hours. The guns fell silent. The Bismarck was still afloat. Her hull was breached, but her armor belt was intact. She was listing and on fire, and all her main guns were out of action, but the ship herself had not been sunk by British shell fire. What happened next is debated. The surviving German crew members maintain the Bismarck was scuttled, that her own engineers opened the sea cocks deliberately to prevent capture. British accounts insist she was sinking from battle damage regardless. The metallurgical analysis conducted on the wreck after Robert Ballard found her in 1989 leans towards scuttling. She lies at approximately 4,700 meters, nearly 5 kilometers down, in the North Atlantic, sitting upright on the slope of an extinct underwater volcano. Her main gun turrets have fallen away from the hull during descent, but the armor belt is intact. The hull structure is sound. A ship that 2 nations argued over for 80 years, whether the Royal Navy sank her or her own crew did, is sitting on the floor of the Atlantic, keeping the answer to itself. She was built to survive anything the Royal Navy could throw at her. 84 years later, at the bottom of the Atlantic, she's still doing exactly that. 2. The submarine they sank to hide it. Longer than a city block and designed to carry aircraft inside its hull, the Japanese submarine I-400 was the largest submarine built by any nation until the 1960s, a record it held for 2 decades. At 122 meters, she could cross the Pacific, circumnavigate the globe 1.5 times without refueling, and launch 3 HE Seiren floatplane bombers from a pressurized hangar built into her bow. She was designed to bomb the Panama Canal. Japan laid down the I-400 class in 1943 as a strategic weapon unlike anything that existed at the time. Submarines that could strike targets previously reachable only by land-based bombers or carrier aircraft. The original plan called for 18 boats. Japan completed 3. The intended target shifted from the Panama Canal to the American fleet anchorage at Alethi Atoll, and the I-400 and her sister boat I-401 were en route to launch that mission when Japan surrendered in August of 1945. The boats turned around and surrendered intact. No mission had been flown. The aircraft were still aboard. American naval engineers had never seen anything like the I-400. The hangar was a sealed cylinder running the length of the forward section of the boat, large enough to store 3 folded aircraft with room for maintenance equipment alongside them. A catapult launch system ran along the bow deck. The recovered aircraft were still functional. The Sarin bombers designed specifically for this class of submarine, with folding wings and tail sections that allowed them to be assembled on deck and launched within minutes. U.S. Navy officers spent weeks studying both submarines in detail. Technical teams documented the propulsion systems, the hangar design, the pressurization and climate control that kept the aircraft airworthy during extended submerged patrols. This was engineering that the U.S. Navy did not have and had not imagined. Then, in the spring of 1946, the Soviet Union formally requested access to the surrendered Japanese vessels under the terms of post-war agreements. The U.S. Navy's response was to take the I-400 and 4 other Japanese submarines out to sea off Pearl Harbor and sink them. All 5 were scuttled before the Soviets could inspect them. The I-400 was found in 2013 by researchers from the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory, lying at about 800 meters off the coast of Oahu. The hull is intact. The hangar hatch is still recognizable. She sits on the seafloor less than 80 kilometers from Pearl Harbor, the port her aircraft were never used to attack, in the waters of the nation that sank her not in battle, but to keep her out of the wrong hands. The Soviets never got a look. The Americans put her on the bottom instead. 1. September 1st, 1985. A camera on the end of a cable towed behind a research vessel in the middle of the North Atlantic showed a boiler sitting in the mud. Then another. Then the bow section of a ship, rising out of the sediment at 3,800 meters depth. Its railing still intact. A davit arm still extended over the side as though a lifeboat had just been lowered. Robert Ballard's team had found the Titanic. She had been missing for 73 years. Not missing in the sense that nobody knew she'd sunk. Everyone knew she'd sunk on April 15th, 1912, 2 hours and 40 minutes after striking an iceberg, taking 1,517 people with her into water so cold that survival in it was measured in minutes. Missing in the sense that nobody knew exactly where she was, or what was left of her, or whether the deep ocean had taken everything. The answer, it turned out, was complicated. The Titanic broke in 2 on her way down. The bow section, which flooded progressively and descended nose first at a relatively controlled angle, hit the seafloor and buried itself up to 20 meters into the mud, intact, largely whole, the grand staircase atrium open to the ocean, stateroom doors still on their hinges, a porcelain sink still fixed to a cabin wall. The stern section, which had no such controlled descent, hit at speed and was destroyed on impact, scattered across a debris field covering roughly 5 square kilometers, a field that also contains everything that fell out of the ship as she sank. Luggage, deck chairs, wine bottles, shoes paired together on the seabed. The shoes paired together are the image that stops people. The bodies are long gone. But leather soles resist decomposition far longer than human remains, and so the seafloor around the Titanic is scattered with pairs of shoes, side by side, marking where someone came to rest. Ballard's discovery in 1985 did something beyond finding a shipwreck. It demonstrated that the deep ocean could be accessed systematically, that a research vessel with the right equipment could locate a specific object at depth in open ocean. And it changed every subsequent calculation about what might be reachable. Every expedition on this list, every remotely operated vehicle sent down into darkness, every dollar spent searching for ships that sank in deep water, owes something to that night and that boiler appearing on a screen. The Titanic herself is not doing well. Colonies of iron-eating bacteria called rusticles have been consuming the hull since the wreck was found, and the rate of deterioration has accelerated. Large sections of the officers' quarters on the starboard side have collapsed since the first submersible dives in the 1980s. The crow's nest, from which Lookout Frederick Fleet telephoned the bridge to report ice ahead, is gone. Marine biologists who have been studying the wreck across decades project that within the next few decades the hull structure will be largely unrecognizable, that the Titanic is in the process of dissolving back into the ocean floor. 113 years after she sank, she is still sinking. The bow still stands. The railing is still there. The davit arm is still extended. At 3,800 meters in the North Atlantic, in total darkness, in water just above freezing, the most famous shipwreck in the world is being eaten alive slowly in the dark. The boiler is still in the mud where Ballard's camera found it.